This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recorded by David Barnes, London, July 2006. The History of England from the Accession of James II by Thomas Babington Macaulay. Book 1, Chapter 3, Part 15. It is not very easy to explain why the nation which was so far before its neighbours in science should in art have been far behind them. Yet such was the fact. It is true that in architecture, an art which is half a science, an art in which none but a geometrician can excel, an art which has no standard of grace but what is directly or indirectly dependent on utility, an art of which the creations derive a part at least of their majesty from mere bulk. Our country could boast of one truly great man, Christopher Wren, and the fire which laid London in ruins had given him an opportunity, unprecedented in modern history, of displaying his powers. The austere beauty of the Athenian portico, the gloomy sublimity of the Gothic arcade, he was, like almost all his contemporaries, incapable of emulating, and perhaps incapable of appreciating. But no man born on our side of the Alps has imitated with so much success the magnificence of the palace-like churches of Italy. Even the superb Lewis has left to posterity no work which can bear a comparison with St. Paul's. But at the close of the reign of Charles II, there was not a single English painter or statuary whose name is now remembered. This sterility is somewhat mysterious, for painters and statuaries were by no means a despised or an ill-paid class. Their social position was at least as high as at present. Their gains, when compared with the wealth of the nation, and with the remuneration of other descriptions of intellectual labour, were even larger than at present. Indeed, the munificent patronage which was extended to artists drew them to our shores in multitudes. Lely, who has preserved to us the rich curls, the full lips, and the languishing eyes of the frail beauties celebrated by Hamilton, was a Westphalian. He had died in 1680, having long lived splendidly, having received the honour of knighthood, and having accumulated a good estate out of the fruits of his skill. His noble collection of drawings and pictures was, after his decease, exhibited by the royal permission in the banqueting house at Whitehall, and was sold by auction for the almost incredible sum of £26,000, a sum which bore a greater proportion to the fortunes of the rich men of that day than £100,000 would bear to the fortunes of the rich men of our time. Lely was succeeded by his countryman Godfrey Kneller, who was made first a knight and then a baronet, and who, after keeping up a sumptuous establishment, and after losing much money by unlucky speculations, was still able to bequeath a large fortune to his family. The two Van de Velders, natives of Holland, had been tempted by English liberality to settle here, and had produced for the king and his nobles some of the finest sea pieces in the world. Another Dutchman, Simon Verelst, painted glorious sunflowers and tulips for prices such as had never before been known. Verrio, a Neapolitan, covered ceilings and staircases with gorgons and muses, nymphs and satyrs, virtues and vices, gods quaffing nectar, and laurelled princes riding in triumph. The income which he derived from his performances enabled him to keep one of the most expensive tables in England. For his pieces at Windsor alone, he received £7,000, a sum then sufficient to make a gentleman of moderate wishes perfectly easy for life, a sum greatly exceeding all that Dryden, during a literary life of 40 years, obtained from the booksellers. Verrio's assistant and successor, Louis Laguerre, came from France. The two most celebrated sculptors of that day were also foreigners. Cibber, whose pathetic emblems of fury and melancholy still adorn Bedlam, was a Dane. Gibbons, to whose graceful fancy and delicate touch many of our palaces, colleges, and churches owe their finest decorations, was a Dutchman. Even the designs for the coin were made by French artists. Indeed, it was not till the reign of George II that our country could glory in a great painter, and George III was on the throne before she had reason to be proud of any of her sculptors. It is time that this description of the England which Charles II governed should draw to a close. Yet one subject of the highest moment still remains untouched. Nothing has yet been said of the great body of the people, of those who held the ploughs, who tended the oxen, who toiled at the looms of Norwich, and squared the Portland stone for St. Paul's. Nor can very much be said. The most numerous class is precisely the class respecting which we have the most meagre information. In those times, philanthropists did not yet regard it as a sacred duty, nor had demagogues yet found it a lucrative trade to talk and write about the distress of the labourer. History was too much occupied with courts and camps to spare a line for the hut of the peasant or the garret of the mechanic. The press now often sends forth in a day a greater quantity of discussion and declamation about the condition of the working man than was published during the 28 years which elapsed between the Restoration and the Revolution. But it would be a great error to infer from the increase of complaint that there has been any increase of misery. The great criterion of the state of the common people is the amount of their wages, and as 4/5 of the common people were, in the 17th century, employed in agriculture, it is especially important to ascertain what were then the wages of agricultural industry. On this subject we have the means of arriving at conclusions sufficiently exact for our purpose. Sir William Petty, whose mere assertion carries great weight, informs us that a labourer was by no means in the lowest state, who received for a day's work 4d with food, or 8d without food. 4s. a week, therefore, were, according to Petty's calculation, fair agricultural wages. That this calculation was not remote from the truth, we have abundant proof. About the beginning of the year 1685, the justices of Warwickshire, in the exercise of a power entrusted to them by an Act of Elizabeth, fixed at their quarter sessions a scale of wages for the county, and notified that every employer who gave more than the authorised sum, and every working man who received more, would be liable to punishment. The wages of the common agricultural labourer from March to September were fixed at the precise amount mentioned by Petty, namely 4s. a week without food. From September to March, the wages were to be only 3 6d a week. But in that age, as in ours, the earnings of the peasant were very different in different parts of the kingdom. The wages of Warwickshire were probably about the average, and those of the counties near the Scottish border below it. But there were more favoured districts, In the same year, 1685, a gentleman of Devonshire named Richard Dunning published a small tract in which he described the condition of the poor of that county. That he understood his subject well, it is impossible to doubt, for a few months later his work was reprinted, and was, by the magistrates assembled in quarter sessions at Exeter, strongly recommended to the attention of all parochial officers. According to him, the wages of the Devonshire peasant were, without food, about 5 shillings a week. Still better was the condition of the labourer in the neighbourhood of Bury St. Edmunds. The magistrates of Suffolk met there in the spring of 1682 to fix a rate of wages, and resolved that, where the labourer was not boarded, he should have 5 shillings a week in winter and 6 in summer. In 1661, the justices at Chelmsford had fixed the wages of the Essex labourer, who was not boarded, at 6 shillings in winter and 7 in summer. This seems to have been the highest remuneration given in the kingdom for agricultural labour between the Restoration and the Revolution, and it is to be observed that, in the year in which this order was made, the necessaries of life were immoderately dear. Wheat was at 70 shillings the quarter, which would even now be considered as almost a famine price. These facts are in perfect accordance with another fact which seems to deserve consideration. It is evident that, in a country where no man can be compelled to become a soldier, the ranks of an army cannot be filled if the government offers much less than the wages of common rustic labour. At present, the pay and beer money of a private in a regiment of the line amount to 7 shillings and 7 pence a week. This stipend, coupled with the hope of a pension, does not attract the English youth in sufficient numbers, and it is found necessary to supply the deficiency by enlisting largely from among the poorer population of Munster and Connaught. The pay of the private foot soldier in 1685 was only 4 shillings and 8 pence a week, yet it is certain that the government in that year found no difficulty in obtaining many thousands of English recruits at very short notice. The pay of the private foot soldier in the army of the Commonwealth had been 7 shillings a week, that is to say, as much as a corporal received under Charles II, and 7 shillings a week had been found sufficient to fill the ranks with men decidedly superior to the generality of the people. On the whole, therefore, it seems reasonable to conclude that, in the reign of Charles II, the ordinary wages of the peasant did not exceed 4 shillings a week, but that in some parts of the kingdom 5 shillings, 6 shillings, and during the summer months even 7 shillings were paid. At present, a district where a labouring man earns only 7 shillings a week is thought to be in a state shocking to humanity. The average is very much higher, and in prosperous counties the weekly wages of husbandmen amount to 12, 14, and even 16 shillings. The remuneration of workmen employed in manufactures has always been higher than that of the tillers of the soil. In the year 1680, a member of the House of Commons remarked that the high wages paid in this country made it impossible for our textures to maintain a competition with the produce of the Indian looms. An English mechanic, he said, instead of slaving like a native of Bengal for a piece of copper, expected 1 shilling a day. Other evidence is extant which proves that 1 shilling a day was the pay to which the English manufacturer then thought himself entitled, but that he was often forced to work for less. The common people of that age were not in the habit of meeting for public discussion, of haranguing or of petitioning Parliament. No newspaper pleaded for their cause. It was in rude rhyme that their love and hatred, their exultation and their distress found utterance. A great part of their history is to be learned only from their ballads. One of the most remarkable of the popular lays chaunted about the streets of Norwich and Leeds in the time of Charles II may still be read on the original broadside. It is the vehement and bitter cry of labour against capital. It describes the good old times when every artisan employed in the woollen manufacture lived as well as a farmer. But those times were past. 6 pence a day was now all that could be earned by hard labour at the loom. If the poor complained that they could not live on such a pittance, they were told that they were free to take it or leave it. For so miserable a recompense were the producers of wealth compelled to toil, rising early and lying down late, while the master clothier, eating, sleeping, and idling, became rich by their exertions. A shilling a day, the poet declares, is what the weaver would have if justice were done. We may therefore conclude that, in the generation which preceded the Revolution, a workman employed in the great staple manufacture of England thought himself fairly paid if he gained 6 shillings a week. It may here be noticed that the practice of setting children prematurely to work, a practice which the state, the legitimate protector of those who cannot protect themselves, has in our time wisely and humanely interdicted, prevailed in the 17th century to an extent which, when compared with the extent of the manufacturing system, seems almost incredible. At Norwich, the chief seat of the clothing trade, a little creature of 6 years old was thought fit for labour. Several writers of that time, and among them some who were considered as eminently benevolent, mention with exultation the fact that in that single city, boys and girls of very tender age created wealth exceeding what was necessary for their own subsistence by £12,000 a year. The more carefully we examine the history of the past, the more reason shall we find to dissent from those who imagine that our age has been fruitful of the social evils. The truth is that the evils are, with scarcely an exception, old. That which is new is the intelligence which discerns, and the humanity which remedies them. When we pass from the weavers of cloth to a different class of artisans, our inquiries will still lead us to nearly the same conclusions. During several generations, the Commissioners of Greenwich Hospital have kept a register of the wages paid to different classes of workmen who had been employed in the repairs of the building. From this valuable record, it appears that, in the course of 120 years, the daily earnings of the bricklayer have risen from half a crown to 4 and 10 pence, those of the mason from half a crown to 5 and 3 pence, those of the carpenter from half a crown to 5 and 5 pence, and those of the plumber from 3 shillings to 5 and 6 pence. It seems clear, therefore, that the wages of labour, estimated in money, were in 1685 not more than half of what they now are, and there were few articles important to the working man of which the price was not, in 1685, more than half of what it now is. Beer was undoubtedly much cheaper in that age than at present. Meat was also cheaper, but was still so dear that hundreds of thousands of families scarcely knew the taste of it. In the cost of wheat there has been very little change. The average price of the quarter during the last 12 years of Charles II was 50 shillings. Bread, therefore, such as is now given to the inmates of a workhouse, was then seldom seen, even on the trencher of a yeoman or of a shopkeeper. The great majority of the nation lived almost entirely on rye, barley, and oats. End of Part 15.